John Malone had never minded the isolation of his Montana ranch. The vast stretches of snow-covered land, the quiet hum of nature, and the rugged beauty surrounding his small log cabin brought him a sense of peace. His family's legacy rested in these windswept hills, where cattle roamed freely and the mountain peaks were bathed in the soft glow of dawn. But lately, the stillness had become a weight on his shoulders, a reminder of what he had lost. 5 years had passed since his wife, Lily, succumbed to a long illness, leaving John to fend for himself. His son, Tom, had moved to the city for college and never looked back. The days felt longer now, filled with the tedious chores of a rancher's life, yet hollow at their core. The farm felt empty, as if the walls themselves echoed with his solitude. The winter had been especially harsh that year. A fierce blizzard had been brewing on the horizon for days, the kind that whispered through the trees and made the very air feel thick and heavy. John had been preparing for the storm, stacking firewood and ensuring the cattle were safely sheltered in the barn. But something gnawed at him, a restless feeling he couldn't shake. Rusty, his loyal border collie, had been acting strangely, pacing by the door and whining into the wind. John figured it was just the storm, but deep down, he felt that something was different. As night fell, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows. And then, just as John settled into his chair by the fire, he heard it, soft, desperate cries from somewhere outside. His heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Rusty barked, and John knew the time for inaction was over. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, stepping out into the freezing night, bracing for whatever awaited him in the storm. This introduction sets up John's character, the emotional tone of the story, and foreshadows the strange and life-changing discovery he's about to make. It also introduces the impending blizzard, heightening the suspense and building up to the main event. Would you like any adjustments or additional details? Hi everyone, welcome to our channel. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. Please subscribe us. The cold hit John like a slap to the face as he stepped outside, the wind biting through his layers. The flashlight beam cut through the swirling snow, barely reaching more than a few feet ahead of him. He called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Rusty!" But the dog had already darted ahead, nose to the ground, following a scent John couldn't detect. It wasn't until he reached the edge of the barn that he saw the movement, a blur of something small and fast, huddled near the old wooden fence. John's heart raced, his breath misting in the air. As he drew closer, the beam of his flashlight revealed something that made his stomach drop. There, lying in the snow, were not one, but 8 tiny lynx cubs, their fur damp and matted from the snow, their eyes barely open, their bodies trembling in the unforgiving cold. The cubs' cries were weak, barely audible over the howl of the wind, but John could see the terror in their faces. They were abandoned, no sign of their mother or any other creature in sight. The smallest one, no larger than a cat, looked up at John with wide, frightened eyes. It was clear these cubs were too young to survive alone in such brutal conditions. He knelt beside them, his gloved hands shaking as he gently gathered them up one by one, marveling at how fragile they felt in his arms. Rusty barked from behind him, anxious but protective. John looked at his dog, then back at the cubs. His mind raced. He knew this wasn't a natural occurrence. Lynx didn't roam these parts, and certainly not during a blizzard this severe. Who would leave these creatures out here to die? There was no time to waste. With urgency, John scooped up the last of the cubs and, cradling them in his arms, made his way back to the cabin, determined to save them, no matter the cost. This section focuses on the emotional impact of John's discovery and the urgency of the situation. It also emphasizes the harshness of the environment and the sense of helplessness John feels as he encounters the cubs. Would you like any additions or changes to this? John carefully laid the cubs down on a pile of old blankets in the warmth of his cabin, the fire crackling fiercely in the stone hearth. Rusty sat nearby, his eyes fixed on the tiny creatures, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. John's hands moved with practiced precision as he hurriedly prepared a space for the cubs, each one wrapped in the thickest layers of warmth he could muster. He heated milk, thinking of his childhood when his mother used to make warm drinks for him after long days in the snow. It was a ritual of comfort, something he desperately needed to recreate now, in a desperate attempt to save these helpless lives. The cubs, too weak to stand or move much, nursed from the bottle clumsily, their tiny paws batting at the warmth. John couldn't help but marvel at how delicate they were, how trusting. Their bodies shook, but they drank, slowly regaining some strength with each drop. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull them back from the edge of survival. One by one, they nestled closer, instinctively seeking the warmth of his touch, as if recognizing him as their protector. John's heart ached as he stroked their soft fur, each one so different yet so alike in their vulnerability. Days passed, and the cubs' bond with John grew deeper. He found himself talking to them more, even when there was no one else around to hear. He wondered aloud where their mother might be, what had happened to them. But with each passing day, he knew the truth, they were his responsibility now, and he would do everything he could to help them thrive. Rusty, who had been so protective of them from the start, grew more attached too. He would curl up next to the cubs, keeping watch over them with the same fierce loyalty he gave John. The bond between the rancher, his dog, and the cubs was growing stronger, woven by the shared experience of survival in the face of the brutal storm. As John sat by the fire, his mind drifted to the impossible journey ahead. Caring for these cubs wasn't just a matter of keeping them alive, it was about giving them a future, one he couldn't even begin to imagine. This section highlights John's nurturing instincts and the deepening emotional connection between him, the cubs, and Rusty. It also establishes the foundation of the cubs' recovery, as well as John's sense of responsibility. Would you like to tweak anything in this part? The days blended into weeks, each one more grueling than the last. John had never imagined that caring for the cubs would be so demanding. The first few days had been filled with hope, as he watched them regain strength. But as time passed, the reality of their needs began to take its toll. The cubs were growing, but so were their appetites and their restlessness. Every few hours, John found himself feeding them, cleaning them, trying to teach them how to behave in the wild. But no matter how much he did, he could never shake the sense that he was not enough, that something crucial was missing. Rusty had been a steady companion throughout the process, his sharp eyes always on alert. He'd help John round up the cubs when they wandered too far, keeping them safe from any dangers that might lurk near the ranch. But there were dangers beyond what John could control, diseases, the creeping cold, the possibility that the cubs' mother might never return. There was a gnawing fear that clung to John's mind each time the temperature dropped. It wasn't enough to feed the cubs and keep them warm. They needed more than he, or even Rusty, could provide. As the cubs began to grow bolder, John started to notice how much they resembled wild creatures in their behavior. They pounced and wrestled, their sharp claws emerging as they tested their newfound strength. It was both beautiful and terrifying to watch. He could see that their instincts were coming alive, but in that same breath, he realized how helpless they would be without the guidance of their mother. One evening, as John sat by the fire, his thoughts spiraled. He thought back to the moment he found the cubs. The storm had been a fury of wind and snow, relentless and punishing. The way they huddled in the snow, so vulnerable, still haunted him. Could they truly survive in the wild without their mother? Could he be the one to teach them what they needed to know? It was a realization that shifted something deep within him. John knew he couldn't keep them as pets, no matter how much he wanted to. They were wild creatures, born for a life far beyond his ranch. He had a choice, to raise them as best as he could, or to prepare them to survive in the wild, to return them to the life they had been born into. His heart ached at the thought, but he knew the truth, he couldn't hold them back forever. This section explores John's growing realization about the difficulties of raising the cubs and his internal struggle about their future. It builds tension, highlighting his concerns while reflecting the challenges of living in the harsh wilderness. Would you like to modify or add anything? John spent the next few days preparing, though every step felt like a struggle against his own heart. The cubs were growing fast, and their playful, wild instincts were becoming more apparent. They climbed trees, pounced on one another with increasing ferocity, and even began to hunt small animals in the woods. John watched them with a mix of awe and fear. They were no longer just helpless creatures in need of a savior. They were becoming lynxes. But with their growing independence came an undeniable reality: John couldn't keep them. Not forever. The world beyond his ranch was where they truly belonged. Still, the thought of releasing them into the wilderness was almost too much to bear. He had come to love them in his own quiet, isolated way. Each cub had its own personality. One was daring, always at the front of every chase; another was more cautious, looking to John for reassurance. Yet, John knew he couldn't protect them forever. The wild was merciless. He had seen it with his own eyes: animals that couldn't adapt, that were too young or too weak to survive. He knew the risks. The days that followed were filled with preparations. John began to teach them the ways of the wild, how to track scents, the basics of hunting larger prey, and the importance of hiding their tracks. Rusty, the ever-vigilant dog, stayed close, watching over the cubs and guiding them when John wasn't there. There was no formal training, no mentor for the cubs, just a man doing his best to pass on the survival skills that had kept him alive in the wilderness all these years. The hardest part was letting them go. John didn't have the answers to all their needs, but he knew one thing: they were ready. This section focuses on John's preparations for releasing the cubs into the wild, capturing both his internal conflict and the practical steps he takes to ensure the cubs' survival. Would you like to adjust or add anything? The morning came, and John stood at the edge of the dense forest, his breath visible in the cold air, heart heavy in his chest. The cubs had grown, no longer the fragile beings he had first found. Their coats were thick and healthy, their eyes sharp and full of curiosity. They circled around him, nudging his legs with their heads, as if they understood that this moment was different. This was goodbye. John crouched down, his rough hands brushing the fur of each cub, feeling the warmth of their bodies under his touch. They were no longer dependent on him, yet they still sought comfort in his presence. His throat tightened as he fought to hold back tears. He had never expected to become so attached to them. They had become a part of his world, his loneliness alleviated by their playful presence. "I know you're ready," John whispered, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. One by one, the cubs ventured into the forest, their movements hesitant at first, but growing bolder with each step. John watched them disappear into the undergrowth, knowing that this was the right thing to do. He had done what he could. Now, the wild would take its course. As he stood there, Rusty by his side, John felt a strange sense of peace. The cubs had found their place in the world, and he had given them that chance. Though he would never see them again, he knew that in some way, they would always carry a piece of him with them, a quiet memory of the man who had kept them alive through the harshest of times. And in return, they had changed him forever. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.